I would now invite the Executive Secretary of ECA, Ms. Vera Songwe, to give her welcome remarks. Ms. Songwe.
Good morning. First of all, thank you very much for being here with us today. I think Said has already gone through a lot of the recognition, so allow me first to repeat it by starting with His Excellency the President of Namibia. Thank you so much for being with us today. I know that you're a friend of ECA, but you're especially honoring Professor Adebayo Adedeji by your presence here today, so thank you very much. His Excellency, the former President of Nigeria, President Yakubu Gowon. I'm Cameroonian, and this name in Cameroon is a lot. So I was saying to the President this morning that when I tell my parents that I met you, they would say, yes, finally, she's doing something right. And so, you know, this is the proof. So it is a real honor to have you with us. The former President of Liberia, President Amos Sawyer, thank you for being with us as well. All the other dignitaries, all protocols observed. Please, of course, my fellow colleagues from the UN, in particular, Mr. Ibrahim Gambari. I think you are the trailblazer for most of us Africans at the UN, so thank you very much for being with us here this morning. We are here essentially to celebrate and remember and then think forward about the life of Professor Adebayo Adedeji. For those of you who were able to be at the celebration of his life yesterday, I think there was a clear message that was delivered at the service at the church in honor of the professor, because he left us with an unforgettable legacy of life, commitment, and service to the continent at a personal, social, and professional level. As stated yesterday by Professor Gidnab, Professor Adedeji was fully engaged in economic independence of Africa, making it his career flag. He was born in 1930. 14 years or 15 years before that was 1914. And 1914 was a decisive moment on the continent. We had just finished between 1884 and 1914 the scramble for Africa and the division of the continent. So he came to life 15 years later. Sorry, 45 years later in 1930. And you can just imagine the kind of academic questioning he must have had. From 1930 to 1960, he was 30 years old when Africa started getting its independence. So this was somebody who had lived the struggle. He understood what it meant. He understood what Pan-Africanism meant. If you go backwards and you look at the maps of Africa in 1914, it was a very different kind of map. If you looked at what was happening in Africa at the time, from 1884 to 1914, we had essentially legalized trade on the continent. We had 14 or 15 nations that sat together in the Conference of Berlin and legalized trade. But it was a different kind of trade. It was a trade in people and a trade of Africa's geography. Between 1884 and 1914, Africa was partitioned. If you could build a post and if you could plant your flag, you owned the territory. So by the time Professor Adebayo Adedeji was born, Africa had gone from being a continent that was already trading with the Middle East. Remember, we had the Ottoman Empire in the 1800s. And then we had trade going up towards the north of Africa, and we had trade going into East Asia. But all that stopped by 1914, and we started trading towards Latin America. But this time around, we were not trading cotton. We were not trading ore. And something that is very often forgotten is around 1700, so just before we were partitioned, we were actually living the Iron Age of Africa. It was an age where Africa and the Bantu spread from the 1300s to the 1800s was going from North Africa, or from West Africa more precisely, down to Southern Africa and out to Eastern Africa, spreading the trade of iron and the commerce of iron and the transformation of iron into weapons, into artifacts, and into other kinds of commodities. So Africa was already transforming, and Africa was already industrializing at that time. Why do I say all of this? Because when one begins to think of the legacy of Professor Adebayo Adedeji, one needs to understand the context in which he was living and his history at the time, and how that history allowed him to transform his thinking and push the continent towards the landmark events that he did, such as making sure that we created an ECOWAS community. Because remember, his legacy is really trying to bring Africa back together, trying to put Africa as one, trying to ensure that we begin again to look at ourselves as we were before 1884. And we are still doing that. So when, in March of this year, we signed the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, I felt like it was an almost honorable transition to be, and for him to be watching us and saying, finally, we are maybe back to that point where we were before 1885, and maybe Africa is coming back, and maybe we need to go backwards a little bit to fly again. But clearly, I think his dream of an Africa that trades with itself, an Africa where economic integration happens because it is important, because it is necessary, because it is needed, is finally at our doorstep. So if there was ever any legacy that ECA could have left for Professor Adebayo Adedeji, is really to keep working on the CFTA. I think that we are also hoping that the country in which we stand in today will also follow that big fight and join us as we work towards the Continental Free Trade Agreement. This really is the legacy for Africa, because between 1885 and 1914, 15 million Africans were taken off the continent. Today we talk about migration, and we talk about 50,000, 100,000 that go into Europe, and it's a big issue. But at the time, the population of the continent was 102 million, and 15 million were taken out of the continent. It was a huge number if you begin to think about movements of people. In Kigali, we also signed the Free Movements of People as a second big landmark event. We had 26 countries that signed the Free Movements of People on the continent. This is because, once again, we are going backwards to realize that as a people, the continent, the 1.2 billion people that we talk about on this continent, cannot realize economic prosperity, cannot realize economic growth if we do not, as ourselves, integrate and trade more and trade better with each other. So as we did the CFTA, a very important landmark was the Free Movements of People that we need to ensure also is ratified. Today we have 26 countries that have ratified the Free Movement of People. I just came back from Mauritania, where we must say that we went from 44 countries that have ratified the CFTA in Kigali to now 49. We had, of course, the next giant that was missing in Kigali, South Africa, join us in Mauritania. So we are still waiting for one more to join us as we move forward on this big fight. We also have, and I think history is important, we had a number of countries that have already ratified. Rwanda has ratified, Ghana has ratified, Niger has ratified, and we have Kenya that has ratified. So 4 countries were the first 4 to ratify. In Mauritania, another 4 more joined the ratification process. We have 22 countries that need to ratify for the CFTA to become effective. So we are hoping that we will be able to do that. I think that when we look at where we are standing and where Professor Adebayo Adedeji sprung from, which is West Africa. West Africa was home to a number of big empires. West Africa was home, essentially, to the first trading processes that happened on the continent, with the Shanghai Empire, the Ghana Empire. Of course, all of us know the story of Mansa Musa, who left from Mali all the way into the Middle East, and the gold trail that he left behind him. What happened later on was we became the continent of resources. And and everybody came to get our resources, and we never transformed those resources. And I think during the tribute that we paid to Professor Adebayo Adedeji in Addis Ababa a few months ago, there was a tape of him talking about the fact that Africa needed to transform its resources. And this is the problem of diversification. We must move into diversification. Economic transformation is important. Economic diversification is even more important. If today the Europeans trade amongst themselves at 60%, it's because they have diversified enough to be able to trade with each other all the other goods that they're demanding of each other. The reason we don't trade with each other enough is because essentially we're all oil-producing countries or cocoa-producing countries, but we can actually move up the value chain. We can diversify our economies and ensure that we start trading more with each other. And I think that this is really the legacy that he's left us. He left us economic transformation. We're moving to economic diversification. We need to diversify. We need to value our knowledge. I think the head of state of this country is about to go to Silicon Valley in a few hours, I think. And that is the service economy, the knowledge. This was really Professor Adebayo Adedeji's legacy again. It's that knowledge. We need to understand who we are. We need to understand where we come from. Our history is important. We cannot say that because we were not born in 1881, or because we were not born in 1914, or because we were not there in 1960, what happened in those years does not matter. It does. We must understand it, we must know it, we must learn from it, because it's only when we understand it and when we learn it and when we take it with us that we will be better. As Africa forms a continental free trade area, it is a monumental effort, it is a monumental task, and the rest of the world is watching us. And the rest of the world is not indifferent to Africa coming together as an economic power. And this is really what Professor Adebayo Adedeji wanted, was that Africa finally could go to the table of negotiations as 1.2 billion people and say, this is how Africa wants to negotiate. And part of the discussions that we are having at the African Union level with the African Development Bank and ourselves is to try to see what that architecture of a one Africa negotiating from an economic place of strength would look like. And really, there's no better place than to celebrate this year and everything else that is happening at the African Union level with Professor Adebayo Adedeji's legacy, having President Kagame and the African Union reform, which is basically saying Africa is going to finance itself, because if Africa can finance itself, then Africa can decide how Africa wants to engage with the rest of the world. Then, as you can see, I think 2018, 88 years after Professor Adebayo Adedeji was born, is really beginning to leave his legacy, beginning to see what it would look like if Africa were to talk to China as Africa. Africa is already talking to Europe as Africa. For the first time, Europe came to talk to Africa and not as independent countries with the meeting in Abidjan. So I really believe that what he started at the ECA, the legacy that he left at the ECA is finally coming to fruit. There is so much that has been done at the ECA that really was the beginning of him, the ECOWAS, the Abuja Treaty, Lagos. For some reason, everything had Nigeria in it when he was there. But giving Nigeria the leadership edge on this discussion, which Nigeria must continue to take, and we're very happy and very grateful to the Minister of Trade of Nigeria, who really led a lot of the discussions around the CFTA discussions. It was not easy, and I think with his leadership, with the leadership that Nigeria has shown in these discussions, we were actually able to move forward. So even if when they were not there at the last minute of the party, we must commend the efforts that were put in place by the government of Nigeria to make sure that these discussions, along with our champion, the president of Niger, bore fruit. Of course, Namibia is one of the countries that we're working with as well on the ratification of the CFTA. So we will come to you, Mr. President, to have a discussion and make sure that you support ECA and the rest of the continent move forward. We at ECA are also working, and I think this is something that Professor Adebayo Adedeji wanted to look towards, is to see how we can ensure that the ECA is moving towards creating an environment for the private sector. We have reached the point now where we did political independence. If we want to talk about economic independence, we must bring in the private sector. So ECA is now launching formally a new private sector division. which is going to be able to bring and engage the private sector more. There is no better place, of course, to talk about the private sector on the continent than in Nigeria. You are the leaders. Again, the vision of Professor Adebayo Adedeji is very clear and very evident through Nigerian businesses that are across the continent, and not only in the big markets. But I think what makes it heartening is that Nigerian financial institutions are in our most difficult countries, in Guinea, in Liberia, in Sierra Leone, where it's not always obvious. In Guinea-Bissau, we find Nigerian financial institutions, and that is part of the dream, I believe, that Professor Adebayo Adedeji had, that prosperity will be shared if we were able to come together as one continent. Professor Adebayo Adedeji's dream would only have concrete meaning if we continue to work, finally, to reduce poverty. And I think that that has become and remains the stubborn problem of the continent. I think just recently, we learned last week that an African country is now the country with the most number of poor people. It used to be India. We have now taken over even that not very distinguished criteria. So we need to work really hard to do that. And I think that part of his legacy is that we continue to see how we can work to reduce poverty on the continent. The Continental Free Trade Agreement can do that, but it would only do that if we are careful and make sure that that poverty is inclusive and that poverty reaches, make sure that no one is left behind. This is essentially what Agenda 2063 of the African Union talks about, and this is what, of course, Agenda 2030 of the United Nations speaks about. So again, in some very seamless way, Professor Adebayo Adedeji has stayed with us from before he was born in 1885 to today in 2018, and we hope that he will stay with us as we move forward to make this dream of one continental economic force a reality for Nigeria and for the rest of the continent. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope.
Thank you very much, Madam Executive Secretary.